Ethan Foster never imagined his solitary walk in a Montana snowstorm would lead him straight into danger and heroism. Tied to a tree, barely alive, was Scout, a severely mistreated German shepherd with a mysterious military past. Who abandoned Scout, and why was Ethan's missing friend, Connor Reilly, involved? As Ethan digs deeper, shocking secrets and deadly threats surface, changing everything he believed about his peaceful town. Would you risk your life to save an innocent dog? Comment below, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible rescue stories. Silver Ridge was a quiet town tucked deep in the Montana mountains, the kind of place where the air always smelled faintly of pine, and time seemed to pass slower than it should. In the dead of winter, it became a place of near silence, broken only by the howling wind sweeping down from the snowy peaks and the creaking of bare trees. On this particular night, that wind carried something else, something heavy and unseen, like a whisper trying to be heard. The snow fell sideways, thick and unrelenting, as if the sky itself had forgotten how to stop. Ethan Foster hunched his shoulders against the storm, the collar of his old brown canvas coat pulled up tight against his neck. He was a large man in his early 40s, with broad shoulders and a solid frame that had once carried people out of burning buildings. His hair, once dark, now bore streaks of premature gray at the temples, and his square jaw was rough with several days' worth of stubble. His steel blue eyes, once sharp and commanding, now seemed dulled by memories he didn't talk about. Ethan had been a firefighter, one of the best in the state, until the fire at Hollow Creek Station claimed 3 of his closest friends. He had made it out, barely, dragging a rookie by the arm, but the weight of those who didn't survive never left him. Since then, he'd live alone on the edge of Silver Ridge, keeping to himself, walking the snowy trails at night when sleep was no longer an option. Tonight was one of those nights. His boots crunched through the frozen underbrush, the beam of his flashlight slicing across the trees like a silent search party. The air was sharp and clean, biting at the edges of his lungs. The pine forest around him stood still, muffled by the snow. He hadn't planned to walk this far, but something in his gut had kept him moving, that uneasy pull in his chest. He learned to trust it during years of search and rescue. He was about to turn back when he heard it. A low, barely audible whimper. Ethan stopped mid-step. At first, he thought it was the wind playing tricks, but there it was again, a sound more desperate this time. He swept his flashlight toward the noise, the beam catching on something darker than snow about 20 yards ahead, near a twisted cedar tree bent low under the weight of ice. As he approached, the shape became clearer. A dog, tied to the base of the tree. His pulse quickened. The animal was slumped in the snow, barely moving. Ropes cut deep into its fur, crude and tight, chafing the skin beneath. Snow had piled up against its side, partially burying one of its hind legs. Its fur was soaked, a thick coat of sable and black matted with ice and filth. When a flashlight caught its face, Ethan stopped breathing. The dog's eyes met his, eyes the color of honeyed amber, wide with exhaustion and pain, but not fear. No, what Ethan saw in them was far worse. It was resignation, hope almost extinguished. He knelt down slowly, setting his flashlight on the ground, hands raised slightly. Hey there, he said softly, his voice low and steady. It's okay now. I'm not going to hurt you. The dog didn't growl, didn't flinch. It just blinked, a tremor running through its frame. Ethan moved closer, inspecting the rope. It was old, frayed at the ends, but the knot was intricate, military style. That wasn't something a hunter would use. His fingers brushed over the animal's flank, feeling the sharp outline of ribs under the wet fur. The dog was starving. I got you, he murmured. With careful, deliberate motions, Ethan reached into his coat and pulled out a folding knife, slicing through the bindings one at a time. The last knot gave way, and the dog collapsed fully into the snow, letting out a ragged breath. But when Ethan tried to lift it, it let out a soft, pained whine. He looked at the collar, half buried under the fur. There was no tag, no name, but this dog wasn't stray. Ethan could see it in the posture, in the steady gaze. This dog had been trained, cared for. And someone had abandoned it here, to die. You're not just any mutt, are you? He whispered. What's your story, boy? He took off his coat and wrapped the dog carefully, lifting it into his arms. It was heavier than it looked, its body limp but warm beneath the soaked fur. He turned back toward the trail, the falling snow thickening as if urging him to hurry. The storm was getting worse. It took Ethan nearly 30 minutes to get back to his cabin, a modest A-frame tucked against the forest's edge. The porch light flickered in the wind, illuminating the path barely. He pushed the door open with his shoulder and carried the dog inside, placing it gently on an old wool blanket by the fireplace. The warmth from the fire quickly filled the room, and Ethan moved with practiced urgency. He boiled water, tore open a pack of instant broth, and soaked a towel to clean the dog's wounds. The animal stirred only slightly, but didn't resist. When he held the bowl of water to its lips, the dog drank greedily, then collapsed again. As the fire crackled, Ethan knelt beside it, running a hand over the dog's back. You need a name, he said. Can't just call you Dog. He studied the animal, its alert ears, the depth in those eyes, the way it still watched him even through exhaustion. Scout, he finally said. Yeah, you look like a scout. The name hung in the air like an oath. Scout blinked once, then rested his head on his paws. Ethan sat back on his heels, staring into the flames. He didn't know who had left the dog out there, but he knew this. He would not let Scout die. Not on his watch. Not again. Morning came slowly to Silver Ridge, dragging pale light through the haze of storm clouds still lingering overhead. Snow had stopped some time before dawn, but the wind continued to lash against rooftops and pine boughs, stirring the powder into soft flurries. Inside Ethan Foster's cabin, the fire was little more than embers. Scout lay curled near the hearth, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, his breathing steady now, though shallow. The once bright whites of his eyes had dulled slightly, but they still tracked Ethan's every movement. Ethan had barely slept. He sat at the edge of the kitchen table, sipping lukewarm coffee, his thoughts circling like crows. The dog hadn't been just abandoned. He'd been left in a way that felt deliberate. And that knot in the rope, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about it. There was structure to it, precision. The kind of knot he'd seen 100 times before, back when he still wore the uniform of a U.S. Forest Rescue operative, and before that, when he and Connor Reilly served side by side in the Army's K-9 Search Division. Connor. That name hadn't crossed his lips in over a year. Ethan looked over at Scout again. The dog stirred at the sound of his voice, a slow thump of the tail against wood. Let's get you looked at, buddy, Ethan muttered, standing and grabbing his coat. I know someone who can help. Clara Bennett's clinic stood on the edge of town, an aging one-story building tucked behind the post office and shaded by a drooping birch tree that hadn't shed its final leaves. A hand-painted sign still hung over the door, though the paint had begun to peel. Silver Ridge Animal Care. Clara had been the only vet in the region for almost 20 years, ever since her husband passed in a car accident and she returned home to start over. She was in her mid-50s now, tall and lean, with silver streaks in her dark hair usually twisted into a low bun. She had a soft-spoken demeanor, but her eyes were piercingly observant, steel gray, with the kind of knowing that came from a life that had taken too much, too soon. When Ethan arrived, cradling Scout in his arms, Clara was already sweeping the walkway clear of snow. She stopped mid-motion, narrowing her eyes as he approached. Ethan Foster, she said, brushing off her gloves. That the reason your truck was seen tearing out of the forest trail last night. He nodded, shifting Scout's weight in his arms. Found him tied to a cedar tree during the storm. He's in bad shape. Clara's expression softened as she stepped forward, gently lifting the blanket to examine the dog. Her brows furrowed. German Shepherd. Male. At least 5 or 6 years old. Look at those eyes, this dog's been trained. She led them inside, into the exam room lit by a single sun lamp and the faint glow of a ceramic space heater. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and cedar shavings. Clara moved with practiced ease, her hands calm and sure as she checked for injuries, dehydration, infection. This is rope burn, she muttered, pointing to the deep abrasions on Scout's chest and front legs. And this one here, old scar tissue for what looks like bullet graze. This dog's seen combat, Ethan. He's a working dog. As she leaned down to adjust the light, her fingers brushed something buried in the matting of Scout's fur, metal. Her eyes widened slightly. She reached in and pulled out a half-buried military ID tag, crusted with mud and dried blood. She wiped it clean. Connor Reilly, she read aloud. U.S. Army, K-9 Division. Ethan froze. No, that can't be. You know him. I served with him, Ethan said, his voice tightening. He was one of the best handlers we had. Transferred out after I left. We lost touch about a year ago. Clara stared at him, then handed over the tag. Well, unless there's another Connor Reilly handling military dogs in Montana, this one's yours. Scout looked up at Ethan just then, as if he understood every word. Ethan sat down heavily on the exam room bench. This can't be random, he muttered. Connor would never leave his dog behind. Something happened. Clara nodded slowly, removing her gloves. And now you're going to find out what. She didn't ask for details. She never did. But Ethan noticed something in the way she glanced toward the front counter, toward a stack of unopened mail and past due notices. Her clinic had been a labor of love, funded more by heart than by profit. He saw it now, the way the front windows hadn't been cleaned in weeks, how one of the heating units rattled when it started. How bad is it? Ethan asked quietly. Clara hesitated. I'm 3 months behind on utilities. The state grant didn't come through this year, and I had to let my assistant go last month. Honestly, I've been thinking about shutting down. Ethan looked back at Scout, now resting quietly on a heating pad. Don't. Not yet. You going to save the clinic, Foster? She said with a tired smile. I'm going to find out what happened to Connor, he replied. And maybe there's something in it that helps us both. Clara didn't press further. She left the room for a moment and returned with a small tray of medication. He'll need antibiotics. Fluids. I'll keep him here tonight. Monitor him closely. I'll cover whatever you need, Ethan said. And Clara, if Connor's in trouble, and this dog made it back to me, then someone out there doesn't want him found. Clara nodded solemnly, her expression darkening. Then I suggest you start digging. And be careful. As Ethan stepped back into the cold, his breath steaming in the late morning light, he felt something shift inside him, a slow, burning purpose. He didn't know where Connor was, or why Scout had been left for dead, but he intended to find out. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he turned back toward town, a name echoing in his thoughts like a ghost. Connor Reilly. And Scout. Scout was the first clue. The storm had passed, leaving Silver Ridge under a bright but brittle sun, the kind that gave no warmth. Snowdrifts towered along the edge of the forest, sculpted by wind into frozen waves. The world seemed quieter after the chaos, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Ethan Foster stood at the edge of the trail where he'd found Scout, boots sinking deep into the snow. He stared down at the area surrounding the tree, his breath fogging in the cold. He had returned alone. Clara insisted on staying with Scout at the clinic, and Ethan knew this was something he needed to see for himself. The rope was still there, coiled in the snow like a discarded snake. Ethan crouched, his gloved fingers brushing the disturbed ground around the cedar's base. Tracks, boots, definitely, led away in 2 directions. One path cut through toward the ridge. The other disappeared back toward town. Whoever had tied Scout, there hadn't been a hurry. The prints were deliberate, evenly spaced, and Ethan's training kicked in automatically. Weight distribution, stride depth, toe angle. Whoever made these tracks was trained and recent. At most, 12 to 16 hours ago. And they weren't alone. Another set of prints, a lighter tread, maybe a woman or a teenager, had passed over the same area before the snowfall began. Ethan followed the first set carefully through the woods, past frost-covered branches and animal burrows half hidden in the drifts. Then he found something else, a cigarette, but still relatively fresh, the filter tinged with red lipstick. He bagged it using a plastic sandwich bag from his coat pocket. A crackle of branches made him tense. He spun toward the sound, hand instinctively resting near the pocket knife clipped to his belt. Nothing. Just wind pushing snow off the pine boughs. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. By the time he returned to town, his hands were stiff and his mind sharper than it had been in months. He wasn't just imagining things. Someone had been out there recently, maybe even watching the place where Scout was tied. The question was why. Silver Ridge's sheriff station sat across from the old railway museum, a squat red brick building with narrow windows and a rusting flagpole out front. Sheriff Will Bowman was standing on the steps when Ethan arrived, sipping from a battered thermos. Bowman was a man built like a barrel, early 60s with a graying mustache and eyes that had long since grown tired. His uniform was neat but faded, and his thick tan jacket hung open over his belt. He had once been an imposing figure in Ethan's childhood, firm but fair. Now, he looked like a man too long rooted in a quiet town, content with the absence of trouble. "Morning, Ethan," Bowman greeted with a slow nod. "Heard you found a dog last night." Word spreads fast. "Yeah," Ethan said shortly. "Scout. Military trained. Left to die in the storm." Bowman took a sip. "Hell of a thing." Ethan pulled out the plastic bag with the cigarette. "Found this up by Cedar Ridge, along with boot prints. Not just any boots, military issue. And the knot used to tie Scout was a ranger's tie-down. Someone who knew what they were doing." Bowman glanced at the bag, then back at Ethan. "You sure you're not reading too much into this? Could have been a hunter, or a hiker passing through. No hunter leaves their dog to starve tied to a tree in a snowstorm." Bowman's jaw tightened, but his tone remained calm. "I understand you're on edge, Ethan. You've been through a lot, but we don't have the manpower to chase every shadow in the woods." "Connor Reilly's dog," Ethan said, raising his voice. "You remember him, right? My buddy from service? He's missing, and I just found his dog half dead in the snow." Bowman sighed and opened the station door. "Come inside. We'll file a report. But unless someone shows up shot or screaming, that's about all I can do for now." Inside the station, the warmth was immediate, but it didn't touch the chill in Ethan's chest. The desk clerk, a young woman with auburn hair named Tessa Holt, gave Ethan a sympathetic glance as he passed. Tessa was new to Silver Ridge, having moved from Missoula 6 months prior. She had the bright-eyed demeanor of someone who still believed in the power of paperwork and rules, though her smile often faltered under Bowman's dismissive leadership. Ethan recounted everything: the tracks, the cigarette, the ID tag, the knot. Tessa jotted it all down, pausing occasionally to ask precise questions. Bowman, meanwhile, leaned against the wall, arms folded, saying little. When it was over, Ethan stood. "That's it? A report?" Bowman nodded. "We'll keep an eye out. But unless you've got a name or a crime committed, there's not much more I can do. I'm not going to send men up the mountain based on footprints and a feeling." Ethan stared at him. What if Connor's in danger? And what if he isn't? Bowman shot back. "Look, I get it. You want answers. But you can't see ghosts in every shadow just because the past still haunts you." Ethan said nothing as he left. Outside, the cold slapped his face like a rebuke. That night, back at his cabin, Ethan sat by the fire, phone in hand, staring at the screen. Clara had texted that Scout was eating small portions and resting. But something else pulled at Ethan, an itch beneath his skin, a flicker of doubt, not about the unknown, but about the known, about the people he thought he could trust. Bowman's dismissal hadn't felt like laziness. It felt like deflection. He poured a glass of bourbon and opened a drawer in the old desk he'd barely touched in months. Inside was a faded photo, for men in uniform, arms slung over each other's shoulders. Connor, smiling. Ethan, younger and hopeful. 2 others who didn't make it back. He turned the photo over. On the back, Connor's handwriting, "We don't leave each other behind." And yet, here Ethan was, left with a dog, a silence, and the growing certainty that someone in Silver Ridge was hiding something. The storm had left its mark, not just on the land, but on everything Ethan Foster touched. It had carved its silence into the corners of his cabin, into the lines on his face, into the steady thud of his boots on old wooden floors. The snow had stopped falling, but its chill remained, creeping under doors and into bones. Outside, the sky was a flat sheet of slate. Inside, the fire in the hearth crackled low and soft. Scout was resting more steadily now. The worst of the hypothermia had passed, thanks to Clara's diligence. His wounds were still raw, but his eyes were alert, following Ethan's every move. The dog had barely eaten the night before, but had taken 2 full bowls that morning, which Ethan counted as progress. It was during a half-hearted attempt to clean out his front closet that Ethan found the backpack. It was buried behind old coats and a snow shovel, an olive-drab military rucksack with faded straps and a patch stitched into the top flap. Reilly. The sight of it stopped him cold. He didn't remember putting it there. Had Connor dropped it off before disappearing? Or had someone else left it behind to be found? He brought it to the kitchen table, setting it down carefully. Scout raised his head, ears twitching. Ethan unbuckled the flap and opened it slowly. Inside, he found a folder, thick with handwritten notes, printed photos, a few flash drives, and a torn topographic map of the surrounding mountain range. He flipped through the pages. Connor's handwriting was jagged, scrawled with urgency, but unmistakable. There were photos of cages, cramped, rusted, blood-stained, exotic animals, birds with clipped wings, wolves with dull eyes, notes detailing transactions, vehicle license plates, descriptions of men with facial scars, tattoos, and rural accents. Most of it was focused on one thing: a covert wildlife trafficking ring operating through the forests and outskirts of Silver Ridge. It had been going on for years, hidden behind a front of abandoned hunting cabins and out-of-state buyers. Ethan's heart began to pound as he read one passage aloud. They're using old ranger trails. Connor suspects someone inside law enforcement is tipping them off. Too many operations moved before we got there. Can't trust local channels. He sat back in his chair, stunned. It wasn't just that Connor had been investigating something dangerous. He'd been doing it alone. And Scout, this whole time, had been part of it. A train tracker, left behind like a warning. There was a knock at the door, sharp, deliberate. Ethan froze. He hadn't told anyone about the backpack, not even Clara. When he opened the door, a man stood there, tall, lean, with a shaved head and a thin scar running down the left side of his jaw. He wore a dark green Carhartt jacket, jeans dusted with snow, and heavy boots. His voice was calm, but held no warmth. Ethan Foster? Ethan didn't answer immediately. Who's asking? Name's Roy Kendrick, the man replied, flashing a badge. I'm with Montana Wildlife Enforcement. Heard you found a military-trained dog up near the ridge last week. Mind if I come in? Ethan hesitated. You got ID? The man produced a folded leather wallet with a clipped state emblem, his name printed under the badge. It looked real enough. Ethan nodded slowly and stepped aside. Scout didn't move, but his eyes locked on the visitor, his body subtly tense. Roy scanned the room like a man used to seeing too much. His movements were precise, practiced. He gestured toward the backpack, still open on the table. That yours? Ethan didn't lie. It belonged to Connor Reilly. A friend. He's missing. Roy nodded. That backpack's dangerous. Excuse me. You're not the only one looking into this, Roy said. Connor stirred up a mess he couldn't finish. And if you're holding his notes, that puts you in the middle of it now. Ethan crossed his arms. Why are you here, really? Roy's eyes didn't blink. To tell you to stop digging. The room fell still. Scout let out a low, guttural growl. Ethan's voice was ice. That a threat? Roy took a slow breath. Call a warning. People involved in this, they don't like outsiders. They don't ask questions. They make things disappear. Connor's lucky if he's still alive. Then he turned, heading for the door. I'd hate to see the next fire in Silver Ridge be yours, he said before vanishing into the snow. Ethan stood frozen for several seconds, fists clenched. Scout padded beside him, nuzzling his hand. The warning wasn't subtle, but it confirmed everything. He retrieved one of the flash drives from the folder, plugged it into his laptop. It contained hours of video footage, trail cam clips, secret recordings, even drone shots of pickup trucks hauling covered cages deep into the woods. One clip showed someone Ethan recognized, Deputy Harold Jennings, Bowman's second-in-command, standing near a cabin and smoking as crates were offloaded behind him. Ethan's stomach twisted. The corruption went deeper than he thought. The sheriff's silence wasn't laziness, it was complicity. He drove straight to Clara's clinic, the folder tucked under his coat. She was in the back, cleaning Scout's temporary kennel. Her expression tightened the moment she saw his face. "You found something," she said, not a question. He laid the folder on the counter. Connor was investigating a trafficking ring. Scout was his partner. Someone left him to die, probably as a warning. Clara flipped through the pages. This is serious, Ethan. It gets worse. The people involved? Some of them were badges. And a man from wildlife enforcement just came to my door to tell me to drop it. Clara stiffened. "Do you believe he was real?" "I don't believe anything anymore," Ethan muttered. "But I know Connor wouldn't have stopped. And I won't either." Clara was silent for a moment, then said quietly, "I'll keep Scout here until we figure out your next move. But be careful. If they're watching you, it won't stop at warnings." He nodded. As he left the clinic, the air seemed colder. The wind carried more than snow. It carried danger and something deeper. Determination. And Scout. Scout followed every step. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of bruised steel. The wind clawed through Silver Ridge like something alive, tugging at shingles, whispering threats through window panes. Another snowstorm was moving in, heavier, meaner than the last. The locals were hunkering down, drawing blinds, and stacking firewood. But Ethan Foster was packing a flashlight, a sidearm, and a folder full of stolen secrets into the passenger seat of his truck. Scout sat in the back, his body still lean from recovery but stronger now. The healing wounds beneath his fur hidden beneath a reinforced vest Clara had stitched from old military gear. His ears were up, eyes sharp, focused, not the broken creature Ethan had pulled from the woods. Scout was a soldier again. The map Connor had left in the backpack was spread on the dashboard, half lit by the truck's overhead lamp. One location had been circled 3 times in red ink. A weather-beaten hunting cabin nearly 20 miles north of Silver Ridge, buried in a thinning strip of forest near the old logging roads. Ethan hadn't been up that way in years. Locals said it had burned down partially a decade ago and never been rebuilt. If Connor had marked it, there had to be a reason. The drive was slow, the road slick with packed snow and flurries already beginning to fall. By the time he turned onto the barely there trail leading toward the old cabin, visibility had dropped to 30 feet. The forest loomed on all sides, branches swaying in protest against the rising wind. Ethan pulled the truck into a stand of trees and killed the engine. "Stay here," he told Scout. The dog gave a low whine, but obeyed, settling down as Ethan stepped out into the storm. The cabin emerged through the snow like a wound, half collapsed, its roof bowed under the weight of years and neglect. But someone had been there recently. Fresh boot prints led around the side. A rusted generator sat near the wall, wires running inside. The front door hung, slightly ajar, snow drifting across the threshold. Ethan moved slowly, gun drawn, his breath misting as he pushed through the doorway. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mildew and gasoline. A single lantern flickered on a crate, casting long shadows against the walls. And then he saw it, a corner of the room, boxed in by plywood and hastily nailed boards. Inside, a steel chain still hung from a hook in the wall. Scratches covered the floor. Hair. Dried blood. Connor had been here. There was more. A padlocked metal crate in the back. Empty, but stained. Evidence tags left behind. Photos tacked to the inside of a cupboard. Wildcats in cages, tranquilizer darts, dollar amounts written in red marker. Names scribbled hastily. Frank S. Bowman, Stitch, Cricket. The names made his blood freeze. Suddenly, the creak of a footstep outside. Ethan turned just as the lantern flickered violently. He dove behind the counter as the front door burst open and 2 men rushed in, one holding a bat, the other a shotgun. Their faces were covered in black ski masks, but their movements were aggressive, rehearsed. "We warned you, Foster," one of them growled. "You should have burned that backpack." A shot rang out, splintering wood near Ethan's shoulder. He rolled to the side, returning fire, grazing one of them in the leg. The man screamed and dropped to the floor. Before the second attacker could react, there was a sudden crash from the doorway. Scout, eyes burning with fury, leapt through the half-open door like a missile. He slammed into the armed man, knocking the shotgun out of his hands and sending both of them sprawling across the floor in a blur of fur and snow and fists. Ethan sprang forward, slamming the butt of his pistol into the attacker's temple. The man dropped. The other, already wounded, tried to crawl toward the exit, but Scout placed a heavy paw on his chest and growled low. "Don't move," Ethan snapped, grabbing the man's weapon and kicking it away. The wind shrieked louder now, filling the cabin with freezing air. Ethan knelt beside the wounded man and yanked the ski mask off. A face he recognized, Frank Stetson, a former hunting guide, known around town for his rough temper and shady dealings. The other man was still unconscious, his mask torn by Scout's teeth. Ethan stared at them, fury in his throat. "Who's giving the orders? Where's Connor?" Frank spat blood. "You think they tell me anything? We're just cleanup. You're the one who stirred up again." Ethan pressed the barrel of the pistol to the floor inches from Frank's face. Wrong answer. Before he could push further, headlights appeared through the storm, cutting across the trees. A vehicle. More of them. Ethan pulled Scout back toward the rear exit. They escaped out the back and circled through the woods, reaching the truck just as the second group stormed the cabin. Ethan got Scout in and floored the gas, careening back down the trail, heart pounding. The storm was at full force now, whiteout conditions, but he didn't stop driving until he was back in Silver Ridge. He parked behind Clara's clinic and ran inside with the folder and Scout close behind. Clara, still in a wool sweater and jeans tucked into boots, looked up from her desk, her expression twisting with alarm. "What happened?" "They're coming faster now," Ethan said, locking the door behind him. "I found the place. Connor was held there. They've got a system, names, payments, buyers, and they sent people to shut me up." Clara grabbed the first aid kit and gestured to Scout. "Is he hurt?" "Just a scratch," Ethan said, running a hand over the dog's side. "But he saved my life." Clara knelt beside Scout, checking him over with practiced hands. Her eyes were glassy. "I'll keep him safe. You need to think about what comes next." Ethan looked out the window, the snow piling against the glass like a warning. "I think we bring the storm to them." The snow had stopped falling by morning, leaving a blanket of silence across Silver Ridge that felt almost sacred. The storm had passed, but its aftermath lingered, in broken fences, in drifted roads, and in Ethan Foster's heart. He hadn't slept. After the ambush at the cabin, everything had shifted. He had seen their faces, heard their threats, and he knew time was running out. Scout lay curled near the clinic's back door, eyes open, alert. His side rose and fell steadily, but there was a new weight behind his gaze, awareness. He wasn't just recovering anymore. He was preparing. Ethan stood at the window with a cup of black coffee in hand, watching the morning sun cast long shadows across the snowbanks. Clara had insisted he stay the night in the spare room, refusing to let him go back to his cabin alone. She sat across from him now, her dark hair damp from the shower, bundled in a thick sweater with sleeves too long for her arms. There were dark circles under her eyes, but her voice was steady. "We have to tell someone," she said. "I already tried," Ethan replied, not looking at her. "Bowman brushed me off 3 chapters ago." Clara took a breath, as if weighing something. "He only brushed you off in public." Ethan turned. "What are you talking about?" She reached into the filing cabinet beside the counter and pulled out a manila envelope. Inside were copies, documents, statements, and a signed affidavit bearing Sheriff Will Bowman's seal. 3 months ago, she explained, Bowman brought Scout in late one night. Connor had dropped him off anonymously and vanished again. Bowman didn't tell anyone, not even his own deputies. But he asked me to document everything. He said he was working against the clock. Ethan stared at her. "Why didn't you say anything?" "He made me promise. Until you got involved." Before Ethan could answer, there was a sharp knock at the front of the clinic. Clara froze. Scout's head lifted immediately. Ethan moved to the front door and opened it to find Sheriff Bowman himself standing on the porch. He was bundled in a navy parka, snow in his silver beard, and his eyes, usually tired, were wide awake. "We need to talk," Bowman said. Ethan let him in, not without a lingering look of caution. The sheriff stepped inside, unzipped his coat, and took off his gloves with the slow precision of a man who knew the weight of his words. "You were right," Bowman said, "and I was never ignoring you. I just had to make sure no one saw me listening." He reached into his coat and pulled out a flash drive, sliding it across Clara's counter. 3 weeks' worth of surveillance footage. Wildlife enforcement offices. Multiple state vehicles rerouted. Deputy Jennings caught on tape at 2 known exchange points. Clara, open her mouth. You knew all this? I've been trying to build a case that sticks, Bowman said. Connor came to me before he disappeared. He was scared, injured, but determined. He handed me Scout's service files and told me if he didn't make it, Scout would find someone who could finish what he started. Ethan's jaw clenched. Where is he? Bowman looked between them. Come with me. They followed him out into the crisp daylight, Scout leaping into the back of Bowman's unmarked SUV without hesitation. The drive took them northeast, away from Silver Ridge, down a snow-covered access road that hadn't seen a plow in weeks. Eventually, they reached a secluded cabin hidden behind a thicket of cedar and birch, smoke curling from a thin chimney. Inside, the warmth of the fire met the scent of antiseptic. And there, seated near the hearth, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, was Connor Reilly. He looked older, thinner, but his green eyes snapped toward Ethan the second the door opened. He stood slowly, bracing against the chair, and when Ethan crossed the threshold, neither of them said a word at first. They just embraced. Scout let out a sharp bark, trotting to his former handler and nudging his thigh. Connor knelt, wincing, and wrapped both arms around the dog. You did good, boy, he whispered. You brought him. They sat for hours. Connor recounted the last year, how his cover had been blown during an infiltration of the trafficking ring, how he had faked his death, escaped captivity, and left Scout behind only when he realized he wouldn't make it out with him. Bowman had found him later, barely alive, and set him up in the safe house while continuing the investigation from within. I knew if you ever saw Scout again, Connor said, you wouldn't stop until you found the truth. I almost didn't, Ethan admitted. But you did. Back in Silver Ridge, the ripple of the takedown was swift. Within 48 hours, the state sent in a task force. Arrests were made across 3 counties. Deputy Jennings was the first to fall, caught on body cam during a failed pickup. Frank Stetson and his accomplice were dragged from their cabins in handcuffs. Roy Kendrick, the man who'd threatened Ethan, disappeared before the Fed arrived. His vehicle was later found abandoned at a rest stop outside Missoula. As for Clara, the town didn't forget. In the weeks that followed, donations poured into her clinic. A statewide animal welfare group issued a grant after learning of her role in housing Scout and protecting the evidence. Volunteers showed up to paint the clinic, fix the fence, and install new heating. Ethan helped every day. So did Connor, once his leg had healed enough for him to stand. The scars of the past didn't vanish, but they stopped bleeding. Ethan, for the first time in years, felt something settle inside him. The nightmares still came, but he wasn't alone anymore. He spent his days rebuilding the outdoor enclosures for injured animals with Clara and walking Scout through the woods, not as a fugitive or a hunter, but as a guardian. Silver Ridge changed, and so did he. In the end, Under the Quiet Storm is more than a story about survival. It's a reminder that even in the coldest seasons of our lives, loyalty, courage, and quiet kindness can guide us home. Ethan, Connor, and Scout each carried their scars, but it was trust, rebuilt step by step, that allowed them to heal. Sometimes the strongest thing we can do isn't to fight alone, but to reach out and let someone walk beside us. In a world that often feels dark or uncertain, may we all find our own Scout, someone or something that pulls us back when we're lost. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment below and subscribe for more stories of healing, courage, and second chances. May God bless everyone watching this. And if you believe in the power of loyalty and love to heal even the deepest wounds, comment Amen.